And here is Respiratory System Part B. So in this PowerPoint, we're going to be emphasizing the transport of oxygen to the cells of the body and the removal of carbon dioxide gas so that the venous blood will sweep that away and bring it back to the heart, which will pump it to the lung to reoxygenate it, to then oxygenate the arterial blood so that the body cells can get their oxygen, and so the cycle goes on and on. Okay, now the first thing that I need to explain, because I'm not going to go into gas laws, so I just want to explain the difference between oxygen and carbon dioxide gas. So you can read this in your spare time, but let me begin. We need oxygen for every cell in the body to do cell respiration, and there's no substitutions, or there are substitutions and you die, like cyanide and carbon monoxide, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about oxygen. Oxygen as a gas dissolves just fine in air. You know, atmospheric oxygen is about 20% of oxygen in the atmosphere. Perfect. But then you're 70% water. And when you breathe in, the alveolar sac is just gaseous, but it has to then move that oxygen into the blood to get it into arterial blood, to get every cell in the body to have oxygen. So here's the problem. It doesn't dissolve at all well in water, and we're mainly water. So how do you get it into the plasma at the level of the alveolar sac? And what the hemoglobin comes to the rescue. Hemoglobin is a red pigment that loves oxygen, adores oxygen, wants to bind oxygen more than anything. And your red blood cells, I would say about 90% of the volume of red blood cells packed full of hemoglobin. So when the hemoglobin in the red blood cell come in contact with the oxygen as a gas in the alveolar sac, it literally will attach to it, and I wouldn't say drag it into the red blood cell, but pretty much. So you have this air interface with the alveolar sac, you have this water interface with the pulmonary capillaries, and the red blood cell is so packed full of hemoglobin that it's very easy for the hemoglobin to move the oxygen from the air into the red blood cell. And it holds on to it, even though the red blood cell 70% water, plasma 70% water, it just latches onto it and holds on to it. Now, in contrast, what's going to happen at the lung with carbon dioxide is, hey, we have carbonated beverages. And carbon dioxide can readily dissolve into water, carbonated beverages. And then if you shake a carbonated beverage, you see all the bubbles and they burst, and CO2 is fantastic in the atmosphere. So it moves air to water, water to air, no problem. And the difference between how these gases operate is very much dependent on how evolution has solved some very fundamental problems. We absolutely need oxygen. We can't substitute it. We're a creature of water. And so if we're 70% water, we want to have oxygen. We have to have oxygen in order to do aerobic respiration. Then you have to find a way to get the oxygen into solution in an effective concentration to keep us alive. So that's the job of hemoglobin and the red blood cell. So, on the other hand, carbon dioxide gas can bubble readily into venous blood, etc., etc. That's not an issue. So, it's very easy for carbon dioxide at the pulmonary capillary level to bubble out into the alveolar sac as a gas. It's much more difficult for oxygen as a gas to get into the blood, and that's the job of the oxygen-loving pigment hemoglobin and the red blood cells. So essentially that is what the slide is all about, and that's essentially why you have all those gas laws. Any gas is going to move high to low pressure, high to low concentration, and CO2 is not a problem, but oxygen it is, hence hemoglobin, hence red blood cells. Now, I'm not going to torture you about the hemoglobin saturation curve. I want to mention it, however, it's not going to be on the quiz. But what's beautiful about hemoglobin is that it can change shape back and forth. So that at the lung, what this is trying to show you is at the lung, at the pressure of the lung, it's about 100% saturated. So all the hemoglobin and all the red blood cells saturated with oxygen, and they go back to the left side of the heart, and it gets pumped into the aorta, and everybody lives happily ever after. Except for the fact that you want the hemoglobin to let go of the oxygen when you get down to the systemic capillaries, because that's the only way you can do aerobic respiration or cell respiration. So what actually happens is that when you get down to the capillary bed, there's a fair amount of pressure that has been bled off by the branching. So the pressure is lower, and that actually changes the shape of hemoglobin so that it's going to release oxygen at the level of the body cell. So it can do cell respiration, make its energy, make its building blocks, and then the carbon dioxide waste product gas can get swept into venous blood and go back to the lung. So that's basically what this is all about, just showing you the pressure changes. So then when you get back to a high pressure of the lung, it changes shape and latches on. When it gets down to a lower pressure at the systemic capillary, it changes shape, so it let goes of the oxygen. And so it flips back and forth. And, there we go. Now, this next concept is intuitive, but when you take or when you have patho, it's going to very much play a big role in the COPDs and other pulmonary pathologies. And that has to do with the concept of ventilation and perfusion. So let me just read the definition. Ventilation, the amount of gas reaching the alveoli, that's going to be oxygen. Perfusion, the blood flow reaching the alveoli, that's the pulmonary capillary. So you got your alveolar sac, that's going to represent the gas that is now in a environment where it can exchange, and then it's going to exchange with what the blood brings it. So you're going to have a lot of oxygen in the alveolar sac, and you're going to have a lot of CO2 in the alveolar sac. I'm sorry, a lot of CO2 in the blood. Hello. So ventilation is the amount of gas reaching the alveolar. Perfusion is the amount of blood flow. Now, it should be a one-to-one exchange. For every oxygen that goes in, there should be one CO2 go out, and vice versa. So it should be ventilation equals perfusion. Now, it's tightly regulated, and in people who are healthy, it's just little blips here and there, little tweakings here and there. But here comes the problem. When we might have a situation where there might be slight bronchoconstriction and the ventilation goes down, what the pulmonary arterioles will do that are feeding the pulmonary capillaries is they'll constrict a little bit. And so the blood flow is just reduced a bit to match that. So it's called ventilation perfusion coupling or matching. And just as an aside, what can happen, and if this makes no sense, don't worry about it, it's not going to be on the quiz. But people who have emphysema, for example, as it progresses, they have problems with right-sided heart failure. And the reason for that is for ventilation perfusion coupling in a pathological way, because sometimes the body is reacting as if it was healthy and it's easy to get back to homeostasis. And in a progressive disease like emphysema, this ventilation perfusion coupling can actually kill people faster. So emphysema, you're having a lot of compromise of ventilation. Ventilation goes way down. You want, therefore, the perfusion to go way down, and the way that you do this with this chronic, debilitating, progressive disease is you will vasoconstrict the pulmonary arteries and arterioles. If you do that, and it's going to be long-term, that's going to cause pulmonary hypertension. And pulmonary hypertension puts an enormous burden on the right side of the heart. And the right side of the heart will try to get muscular, but that actually makes it worse because the chambers get reduced. And in the end, the right side of the heart can collapse. So the ventilation perfusion coupling concept is important, especially when you get into pulmonary diseases, because very often if it's a chronic type of condition, that then can end up affecting the heart. So there would be like one question on the quiz about that, but that's an important concept. You want it to match because you want for every O2 to have a CO2 exchange. And it works fine with healthy people. People have pulmonary problems that are chronic and progressive, not so much. All right, now we get to another huge concept that can get very confusing, and I will try to simplify it as much as possible. So carbon dioxide transport. Now we know CO2 easily bubbles into liquid, bubbles out of liquid into gas, easy peasy. So when you get down to the systemic capillaries, where the cells will take in the oxygen and then boot out the carbon dioxide, gas, and water, and then the venous blood is very high in CO2, the carbon dioxide is transported in a different way. So about 10% is dissolved directly into plasma, about 20% can hop on board hemoglobin, and 70%, the majority of carbon dioxide gas and water, becomes the bicarbonate buffer system in venous blood. This is a slide from hell, but if you love chemistry and chemical equations, this is trying to show you that the carbon dioxide can go in, see the big arrow, go in to the red blood cell, where there is an enzyme that will make it into the bicarbonate buffer. And then one of the major forms of the bicarbonate buffer is sodium bicarbonate. And then why that is, I'll tell you in a second. And then when you end up getting to the lung, this entire equation will go in reverse. So let me get to the next slide and make some sense of all of this. Why bicarbonate buffer formation in venous blood? All right. So what it says is the body cells take up oxygen and glucose and form CO2 and water as a waste product that gets dumped into venous blood. You need to also consider that what also gets dumped into venous blood the very acidic and basic breakdown products of fat and protein. Now, the breakdown products are acidic and alkaline enough to throw off the pH balance of 7.4, and that can be lethal because if it wasn't buffered, if it wasn't neutralized, these can cause acidosis or alkalosis, which can be fatal. But to the rescue! The bicarbonate buffer can neutralize these acidic and alkaline waste products into the 7 range, and then at the lung, the bicarbonate buffer is converted back to CO2 gas, and you exhale it. So the bicarbonate buffer works in venous blood to maintain a neutral pH until the lung can exhale the CO2 gas. So let me translate that. Every cell in the body does cell respiration. Every cell in the body takes in the oxygen and glucose and boots out the CO2 and water. But that isn't the only thing that cells do. Cells also get a lot of building blocks that they need from breaking down proteins and breaking down fat. I'd love to tell you that we can all live on a piece of bread and just live off of carbohydrates and make a lot of glucose and breathe a lot and would be fine, but no, because we have muscles. And we want to store fat for a rainy day. So problem is that when we eat protein and eat fat, the breakdown products of digestion tend to be pretty acidic. So things like pyruvic acid, uric acid, don't memorize these, but just these are common acids that are made from the breakdown of fat and protein. Um, Urea is a very alkaline or a basic breakdown product of protein. So one of the things, except for the stomach, that the body will not tolerate is to have blood, for example, be either above 7 or below 7. It's just not allowed. And the reason why it's not allowed is that most of your metabolic enzymes, which are proteins, would be permanently disabled when the pH goes below 7 or above 7, and you can't get it back. It's irreversible. So then if the person cannot compensate for the acid waste products, they will then go into acidosis, and if not corrected, a coma and death. So it's essential to be able to neutralize. To neutralize means to get back into the 7 range, because 7 is neutral. Below 7 is acid, above 7 is alkaline, 7 is neutral. Buffers are a fantastic way of neutralizing strong acids, strong bases, and to neutralize them, get them back into the 7 range. So the brilliance of the body is to take 2 waste products, carbon dioxide gas and water, that you know that every cell is dumping into the venous blood, get them into the red blood cell that have an enzyme that will make them into the bicarbonate buffer system. A buffer it's like a penny. A buffer is like a penny. A penny is a penny, but a penny has a head and a penny has a tail. And you definitely know the difference. So a buffer is a buffer. A bicarbonate buffer is a buffer. It's like a penny, but it's going to have a weak acid form and a weak base form. So the way that you neutralize is you would take a strong acid and a weak base, and they will come together and give you neutral 7. This is no math involved. This is just kind of like logic. And if you have a very strong base or alkaline waste product of digestion, you match it up with the weak acid form of the bicarbonate buffer system, and you get it back to neutral, get it back to 7. The body, in its evolutionary design, knows how much bicarbonate buffer to make. It's kind of a supply and demand, so that all of the waste products are breaking down protein and fat, which you have to utilize the building blocks to maintain a healthy body. While those waste products are moving through the venous system, they are being neutralized by bicarbonate, which is being made simply by taking carbon dioxide gas and water. And the weak acid or the weak base form of the bicarbonate buffer system is in the 7 range. So then what's going to happen is you transform the strong acids and bases by the bicarbonate buffer system into weak acids and bases in the pH 7 range. And then at the lung, everything is going to go in reverse. Those weak acid and bases of the bicarbonate buffer system go back into the red blood cell, which will then convert them back into carbon dioxide gas and water. Then you will exhale them and essentially remove them from the body by expelling them, by exhaling. It's a brilliant system. It's a confusing system. But hopefully understanding why the body has to do this, and it has successfully figured out. Now, it's not the only way that perhaps you might envision the body doing it, but it's the way that the body does do it. So that's the reason why you have to have a bicarbonate buffer system, especially in venous blood. The beautiful thing about it is that you take what is in venous blood, the carbon dioxide gas and water, you get them into red blood cells, you make the bicarbonate buffer. They buffer everything on the way to the lung, and when you get to the lung, they just reverse it and form CO2 gas. The water stays in the body, and you exhale CO2. The other thing to tuck in the back of your mind, because we'll bring it up again when we do acid-base, CO2 is a source of acid. So when you have situations where you might have pulmonary problems and the person cannot exhale properly, and that carbon dioxide is retained in the blood pathologically and it goes into arterial blood, then that can cause acidosis. If a person vomits and all that hydrochloric acid goes down the hopper, then knowing that CO2 is a source of acid, the person will breathe more shallowly and retain the CO2 because it's a source of acid and the person just lost it, and it's a way of compensating. So it's an important concept, and yes, it is somewhat of a confusing concept, but hopefully if you understand why in venous blood you make the buffer in order to neutralize the strong acids and bases of the breakdown of protein and fat, and then you get them from strong to weak, and then weak to CO2 gas, and you're all set. And this is a proof of it at the lung. So this is showing you that your sodium bicarbonate can come back, get reformed into carbon dioxide, gas, and water. The CO2 goes in, the water stays in the body, you exhale CO2, and there you go. Again, a slide from hell, but it kind of proves the point. All right, so the last thing I need to talk about is regulation. So in regulation, what you have is a negative feedback mechanism with the respiratory control center of the medulla. Yes, the pons has a little bit to do with it, but it's mainly the medulla oblongata that's going to regulate the rate and depth of breathing to keep you in homeostasis. So you have to have a system, you have to have a sensory system feeding that information to the brain and the brain responding. So the sensory neurons that are going to sense the gas levels of CO2 and oxygen are called chemoreceptors. And they are located in the aortic and carotid body. So they're located in the aorta and the carotids, and they are constantly looking for the gas content, which apparently are chemicals, I'm not sure, but anyways, they're the chemoreceptors. Now, this is the next part is counterintuitive. If somebody asked me what the chemoreceptors would first respond to versus second respond to, it would not be what the body does. The body first responds to, the chemoreceptors first respond to carbon dioxide gas. Is the gas too high in arterial blood? Is the gas too low in arterial blood? Second is oxygen, not first. It's not as though it ignores oxygen, but the CO2 is more important and it has more of a priority. Oxygen comes second. So it does ask the question of the oxygen. Is it too high in arterial blood or is it too low in arterial blood? So why the difference? So the difference has to do with the fact that carbon dioxide gas can be a source of acid. And we are acidotic creatures. We are omnivores. We eat, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, nucleic acids along the way. And because we are omnivores, we tend to make more acidic waste products than alkaline waste products. So it's really important to get rid of a source of acid like carbon dioxide gas. If you retain too much CO2 in arterial blood, you're in acidosis. And then if you cannot correct that, it's very quick. If you have a child who's a diabetic type 1 and they're in ketoacidosis, you head to the emergency room. So that's the rationale behind the chemoreceptors. First and foremost, looking for that CO2 level. Is it too high in arterial blood? And then the oxygen comes second. Certainly you have to have oxygen. It's just more that acidosis is a more dangerous situation. And the second is going to be the low oxygen in arterial blood. What then happens is that that respiratory center in the medulla is going to get all that information, and according to its priorities, which of course is get rid of the CO2 and retain the oxygen, it will change the rate and depth of respiration to get that person back into homeostasis. Okay, and here we go. Now, again, this is a diagram from hell. It gives you way too much information, but what it's trying to show you is a negative feedback system. So let's take a situation where you have too much carbon dioxide and you're firing these chemoreceptors. And what is the medulla going to do with that? So what the medulla is going to do with that is actually alter the rate and depth of respiration, so the person is breathing out more carbon dioxide. They are actually hyperventilating. So let's, as far as negative feedback, you want to get back to homeostasis, where the amount of CO2 in arterial blood is homeostatically low, and all of a sudden it's very high. So it's very high, and negative feedback means opposite. So if it's very high CO2 in arterial blood, you want to get it lower. You want that response to be lower so you get back into 7. So if it's high, chemoreceptors fire that info to the medulla then makes the person hyperventilate. So the person is blowing off more CO2, removing it so that the arterial blood gets back to low CO2. So that's that negative feedback loop. And no matter if you want to retain the CO2 or get rid of the CO2 or you want more oxygen, whatever it may be, that is how. So if the oxygen is low, you want the negative feedback to make it higher. If it's too high CO2, you want the negative feedback to give you low CO2. So that's the negative feedback loop that happens automatically. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to think about it. It plays a big part in pathologies like COPDs, but that is for patho, this is normal. And I think that is it for control. Yes, it is. So that's it for the respiratory system, and I will look forward to chatting about the digestive system in week 3. Thanks.